Welcome. I'm Wim Newton, and this is Self Tech. Today, we're going to have a wonderful opportunity to talk to Nicole Zawoski along the forgiveness journey. It is indeed a journey that we go on if we hope to enjoy the benefits of forgiving someone. Nicole is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She's a writer, she's a speaker, and along with Terry Hargrave, they developed this book, Families and Forgiveness. Now, the book that she's going to be drawing her information from is basically for clinicians. So I hope that our discussion, not only during this video, but the videos that follow that break down each one of the stations of forgiveness will be something that will be easily grasped and that you will be able to apply readily in your life. So let's welcome Nicole Zawoski. And the book on forgiveness is one that's especially intriguing to me because we deal a lot with that in our professions and personally in our own lives. Tell me a little bit about, or tell our listeners here, Nicole, a little bit about yourself, your profession as a marriage and family therapist, and also how the collaboration with Dr. Hargrave kind of developed.
Absolutely. So I am a marriage and family therapist in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a smaller town in Connecticut just outside of New York City. We moved here almost 10 years ago, which is hard to believe. After I did all my training in California, both my undergraduate degree in psychology at Pepperdine, and then got my master's in marriage and family therapy from Fuller Seminary. Most of my work entails my private practice in Greenwich. I was for several years involved with the Hideaway Experience Marriage Intensives, where I got to practice restoration therapy in a more intensive setting. And I also write both from a professional perspective and a personal perspective on how the themes in restoration therapy have shaped my clients' lives, but also how that they've shaped my own personal life, including my own marriage and family.
Right.
I met Dr. Terry Hargrave while I was a student at Fuller. He had been a professor in the marriage and family therapy department for a couple years before I was a student there. And I just fell in love with the way that he does therapy. He's one of those professors who's very hands-on, and so it was very clear to see how the model he developed played out. He did a lot of role play type teaching, and so I really got a feel for what this model looks like practically. And I just thought, goodness, if I can be half that kind of therapist and learn to do therapy that way, that's what I want to do. And so I pursued him as a trainee and said, whatever time you have to give in helping me understand and learn to see stories the way that you see stories, and to help people the way that you've been able to help individuals, couples, and families, I'm here for it. And he has been so generous in sharing his time and talent and wisdom with me. I'm also very close with his wife, Sharon, who's also a gifted therapist, and have benefited from that relationship, personally and professionally as well.
So how did you guys decide to collaborate on the book on forgiveness?
That's a great question. His model on that was really unique, unlike anything I had ever heard before. And one of the things that initially drew me to it was that it seemed to address a lot of the misconceptions about forgiveness that I had heard from Christian circles or church settings. And it certainly is a faith-informed model, but it felt very psychologically sound as well, and more practical for what forgiveness actually looks like in different kinds of situations. And I know we'll talk more in detail about what that means. The other, how the book came about was Terry has done a lot of personal work in the area of forgiveness in his own family, which you can certainly read about in the book. He's quite vulnerable in sharing his story, and how that helped shape his model. Where our stories differ is restoration of the relationship was possible for him in his work of forgiveness. My story is a little bit different, where as I began to understand his model, I started doing my own work of forgiveness with some extended family members that I had had some trauma with growing up. And in my particular situation, restoration of the relationship was not possible. And so I really pursued that forgiveness work in what we call salvage, where the relationship was not restored, but I was able to forgive and move forward in a healthy way that benefited my other and future relationships. And so we thought this would be a really good project to collaborate on, because I can speak personally to what it's like when you can't restore the relationship, and he, of course, could speak to it in situations where you can.
Yeah, you brought up kind of the two areas, both restoration and salvage. Before we hit that, you talked about some misinformation that you had received, and I think a lot of people receive about forgiveness, especially from religious circles, Christian circles especially, I think is guilty of that. Speak a little bit to that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So I know one of the things that we probably all have heard at least one point in our lives that I had heard often was forgiveness is just letting go. That if you are not moving on or even forgetting about it and never bringing it up again, then you have not forgiven. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this model is that one of the things that we say is forgiveness that's worth anything always demands some kind of change moving forward. And in order to change and to continue walking in that new way, you have to remember what happened and what didn't work, what led you to that violation in the first place. And that doesn't mean that you are using that as an excuse to punish or get revenge or carry resentment, but we have to remember what we're taking off if we want to continue to walk in the new way and put something on that's new and different. Another misconception that I think we often hear is forgiveness is sort of this term that's thrown around, assuming that it's like an umbrella, and that forgiveness is the same as restoration. Like it automatically means that the relationship is restored. And
yeah, trust has been built, and I throw myself right back into that relationship.
Exactly. And it is a beautiful thing when that can happen. And certainly sometimes forgiveness does look like that. But certainly in my personal situation, it couldn't look like that, and it wouldn't have been safe for it to look like that. And so I think we as Christians, or sometimes in religious circles, we judge, oh, you haven't forgiven as much as the person who has restored the relationship. And one of the things that Terry and I would say about it is, even if only a couple stations, which we'll talk about, are possible, that is just as much forgiveness as if the relationship was restored. It just depends on what's appropriate and safe for your particular situation.
And that it has a tendency for many people to be more of a process than just a single event. It's not just
Absolutely.
I have,
It is a process by which love and trust are restored and reestablished in relationship.
okay.
And that will have many faces. But it is not the moment, it's the process.
Okay. So if you were to, maybe somebody comes to you and asks, so what exactly is forgiveness? How will I know if I've done it?
Hmm.
What would you tell them?
Well, I would first give them that statement that it's the process by which love and trust are reestablished and restored in relationship. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship that was harmed is restored. Sometimes that restoration looks like understanding how this impacted me, what kind of pain I've been carrying around, understanding the way in which I might be tempted to react to that in a way that harms other innocent parties. And for me to do the healing work of learning to tell myself the truth and do something different with that pain, and be a good steward of my pain so that I can keep the violation where it belongs in the relationship that was harmed and not have that pain be perpetuated in other relationships.
Right. So lots of people have heard the expression that lack of forgiveness or resentment is like drinking poison and expecting it to kill the other person. Is that a valid statement? Are we looking at a difference, Nicole, between resentment and or bitterness and unforgiveness? I know I probably threw several things at you right there, but
No. I see resentment as more of an unhealthy coping to a lack of fairness that's being felt on the part of the individual. So I think they're related, but different. Resentment is probably what you're going to see above the waterline on the iceberg, and that's just a clue to you that either you're feeling unsafe, it feels like something is not fair, something is not right or just. And that's something to pay attention to as a clue for a feeling that you might need to get some healing in.
Yeah. So can you still hold on to resentment and forgiveness at the same time? Can they even fit
I
in
don't
this?
I don't think so. I think you can hold somebody responsible for their actions, but I think there is a difference between that and carrying around the resentment that's going to eventually leak out not only in your relationship with yourself, but in your relationship with other people.
Okay. Well, we have heard of, Kubler-Ross's stages of grief.
Mhm.
But I hear you guys kind of challenge the concept of stages and replacing that more with stations. Would you speak to that and maybe what those stations are?
Yes, the reason we use the term stations, so the 4 stations of forgiveness instead of the 4 stages of forgiveness. Stages implies a couple things. It usually implies that there's an order to it. So I start with the first stage, I move on to the second, and so forth. With these stations, we have found that they're more like stations that you visit, and you might do station 2 before you go to station 1, or you might do, some people are really committed to doing station 4 before they do 1. And so it there is somewhat of a natural order, but not every situation fits into that. And so the word station gives us more freedom to visit them in the order that makes sense for the situation.
And I think probably Kubler-Ross would say that they suggest the same thing. They know that it can't be a linear process that you go through
Exactly.
when you're done. So, but it does
Exactly.
allow, yeah, the stations concept does allow the idea that you visit different stations at different times, and you
Yeah,
can repeat that several times.
Yes, and it also allows for the idea that you might visit them more than once. So
Yeah.
if I do a station two and then I am able to go through the rest of them and then I find, you know what, I need to go back to that station because some new information has come up or I'm really struggling in this certain area and I need to revisit that. Which I think Kubler-Ross would also agree with, that you
Sure.
might repeat some.
So talk to us about those stations as you were referring to them.
Sure. So the first station is the station of insight, which is essentially getting the lay of the land. It's understanding the system that has been put in place where the harm or the violation was allowed to take place, like the system that supported the
Yeah.
violation.
And for the people who are listening to this, we're going to come back with
Yeah.
other videos that's really going to flesh out these a little bit more. And so, as you just give us a 15 to 30,000 foot view of these,
Yes,
we're going to dive into it a lot more in just a little bit.
absolutely. And the second station is the station of understanding, which is a process of learning the offender's story and learning a little bit about their background and limitations, um, which can be really helpful. Um, the third station is giving opportunity for compensation, and this is really the process, the active process in which trust is put back into the relationship. I have clients that call it a trust bucket. And so these are actions and reliability that takes place over the course of time that allows that to happen. And then the fourth station is overt forgiveness, which is what most of us think of when we think of forgiveness. It's kind of it looks like the tip of the iceberg. This is the actual apology. I'm sorry. I forgive you. Conversation, which has more detailed elements than one might think, but we'll go into that in a
Right,
bit.
right. So of those four that you've mentioned right there that are in the process of forgiveness, um, is there one that you've identified, Nicole, that people have the most difficulty with, or even one that you believe is kind of foundational that if you don't visit, you probably won't be able to move forward? Is that fair?
Yeah. So the one, and this is completely based on my own clinical practice. The one that has the most stickiness for people that I find is a station of understanding, because understandably so, our protective senses come up when we think that understanding is equated with excusing. And I'll go into this in more detail. Understanding is absolutely not excusing the harmful behavior. But being able to hold those in tension can be really difficult for people. As they hold somebody responsible for the violation, can I still understand them as a human being? And that's a tough thing to do, especially depending on the situation.
Right.
The one that, oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Nicole.
The one that feels foundational to me, only because it does provide the lay of the land, is insight. Um, and I think being able to understand the system that allowed for that violation in the first place is, it just feels like the foundation of a house. I've certainly encountered situations where we spend way less time on that one than other ones. But at least for me as a therapist, and usually it's quite helpful for clients as well. That's an important one because unless we're in an empowered position and safe, it's very difficult to do work that requires vulnerability.
Yeah.
And so that is a station where we build the client's empowerment, and safety. And it's very difficult to do the rest of forgiveness work without that.
Yeah, I think I wanted to just touch base on that as well, because that's the one that I have found important, especially as I do couples work, or any other kind of relationship, where the person who was the violator, if you will, who is seeking forgiveness from the person they violated, until they really understand, or excuse me, have insight with the language of the model. Until they really have insight into the effect of their violation to that relationship, the person who was violated just really can't seem to move forward. At least to be able to release that forgiveness, to be able to restore the relationship. And I often tell them that until they're able to speak to the heart, it's not just that I, for instance, had an affair. It is that this affair caused you to feel and then speak to their pain, worthless, not good enough, insignificant, not measuring up. Until that kind of language takes place, I've just personally found that the one who was violated just really doesn't think that they get it. Right. And I found that to be important.
That's such a great point. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think we think of the violation often as the action, what happens, and what you're speaking to that's so important for every station in the forgiveness model is understanding that the violation is actually the violation of love, which is going to have to do with our identity, harmful message about our identity, or the violation of trust, which is going to give us a harmful message about our safety. We've got to know what that is. And so often, understandably so, we think of the violation as the harmful action.
Yes. I hope you've enjoyed this general overview of forgiveness. And in the following segments, we will be looking at each one of those stations that she referred to. If you want to get in touch with Nicole, she really does enjoy connecting with those who follow her. If you'll go to the link that you see on the screen here, that will take you to her. Other things that we'll be looking at, and I have another opportunity to interview her regarding her book that she wrote, From Lost to Found. And so I look forward to that interview as well. So a better self, a better world, Self-Tech.